I would ask you all to to chat me directly, David Bernstein, chat me directly your questions, and I will pose them to our speakers. Okay, so please start thinking about your questions so that we can get move forward in the conversation. And with that, I'm going to ask Eric to give us a few minutes.
David, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be on a call with so many of you. I've been sending some individual chats, just saying hi to some faces I see, and thanks for joining with us. And I'm glad to be here with Carly today. We really want to first give a disclaimer, right? This is really a reflective conversation. This is just a chance to kind of explore questions and ideas that we've not been able to speak about together. So much has happened, I think, even since the last time I've spoken with folks. And so it's a catch-up time. And I hope that all of us kind of enter it in that space, meaning with curiosity, right? And trusting the good intentions of all of us on this call. The last piece I just want to put out there as a disclaimer is, I want to be clear. I am a supporter of Black Lives Matters and Movement for Black Lives, and we will get into that a little bit, but that should not be confused as me speaking on behalf of the Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matters. And so I hope folks will honor a little bit of that distinction. It's not my role to represent the movement, but to reflect on it as part of a movement I'm involved in. And I think it's an exciting time. But look, so much has happened. I believe, the last time we've had a conversation like this may have been back around 2016, when the Movement for Black Lives issued an issue statement on enforcement that I felt overly focused on Israel. I know others did as well. I certainly raised my critiques, as others had done. But I thought it was the start of a really important conversation within the Black and Jewish community. And if nothing else, I'm grateful that conversation continues to happen. Largely led by Jews of color within the Jewish community and others. And that conversation needs to continue to happen. I was really just excited to see that JCPA has designed some other conversations that are coming up after this one in the weeks to come that also focus on that. So this is not a one shop. And lastly, I just want to thank Jackie Condego, who texted me one day. And you all may know Jackie, great leader in the Jewish community out of Greater Cincinnati. And she asked if I had written anything on this. And I pointed out the essay that Carly had written around why the Jewish community really needed to see Black Lives Matter as an opportunity to strengthen civil rights in this country for all of us. And I just thought, what a great opportunity to sit with Carly, to hear a little bit from her, to be in dialogue with you all. So that's first. Let me jump into some reflections that I have right now. As I continue to address anti-Semitism, not just within the white nationalist movement, but across the political spectrum, right? Trying to bring attention to it, as many of you are, right? Something tragic happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it was the killing of another unarmed African-American male. We are now all aware of the national protests that have been happening around the country, and really an expansion of the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matters. There has certainly been wrestling and confusion within the Jewish community around what does it do in this moment? Where does it lean? And I want to share just 3 reflections to enter into this conversation. The first is, you know, I would say that it's important to realize, right? We hear lots of terms: movement for Black Lives Matters, defund police, right? Hashtags, organizations, leaders. What does it all mean? And what's important to realize is that the movement for Black Lives is a very loose network of individuals and activists from around the country. It involves both individuals and organizations. And there are lots of varying opinions within the movement, as we'll hear from Carly in a little bit. And what's important for us to understand is we should eschew drawing really broad strokes and brushes around what the movement for Black Lives believes or doesn't believe. When you see those broad strokes being painted, we have to look at it with a little bit of suspicion. I can tell you quite honestly, it is a very diverse movement with lots of different thoughts. Within that larger movement for Black Lives is an organization called Black Lives Matters, right? And Black Lives Matters is a significant entity that was started by 3 African-American women, one who is a Jew of color, right? And that organization has no policies in terms of Israel and Palestine. And I think what is often happening is that people are confusing hashtags with organizations, with networks. And it's leading us to conclusions that I think could damage the work that has gone into reconstructing what I would call a 21st century civil rights movement that centers the Jewish and Black community in the United States. A 21st century civil rights movement that understands the importance of not only taking on racism, but also anti-Semitism. So I caution folks not to have, I'm not saying don't have critiques, I'm not saying don't have hard questions, right? Don't step away from holding us accountable when you think we need to be held accountable. What I'm saying is don't buy into the idea that there is one, concentrated leadership or organization that is speaking on behalf of everyone. That's just not the case. The second piece that I would like to dive into a little bit beyond not just over stereotyping this moment is to understand that anti-Semitism is still very real in our society. And many of you have heard me say, there's no such thing as right-wing or left-wing anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism in America, and how political movements sometimes intentionally or unintentionally tap into it, right? And I want to say that again. What I'm saying is, I don't believe that, white nationalists created anti-Semitism, nor do I think the left or Black Lives Matters created anti-Semitism. They are merely functioning on anti-Semitism that exist in society. And some organizations and individuals across the political spectrum sometimes tap into that anti-Semitism for lots of different reasons, driven by bias and scapegoating, right? But the white nationalist movement has tapped into their anti-Semitism to create an environment of violence. And in our critiques of our own movements, right, our own social equity spaces, we should not forget, even as we strive to hold one another accountable, because we should, right, that the real, actual, measurable danger right now are individuals who are using anti-Semitism to fuel violence in this country. And not simply violence against Jewish communities such as Tree of Life, but using it to fuel violence that targets people of color, such as the mass shootings in El Paso, such as the Black church shootings in Charleston that we just honored the 3-year anniversary of. All of those acts of violence by the white nationalist movement are driven by an idea that they are in an existential war against the Jewish community. So none of us should forget in this moment, right, that even as we argue and demand more from each other, right, that we are all being targeted in this moment because of anti-Semitism. My last piece is this, because I said I would only talk for 5 minutes, and I bet I'm on 8 now, is this. There is an opportunity that could be lost here. If we treat, right, the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matters as if they are David Duke and the Klan, right? If we treat the anti-Semitism that arises within that movement as if it's the same anti-Semitism that's arising from the white nationalist movement, meaning the same fervor, the same intensity and intention, that's what I mean. We stand a chance of not only, right, dividing, right, the Jewish community from the African American community at a time where it needs to be greatly tied to one another in terms of destiny. But it is possible that it could create an irreparable rift generationally within the Jewish community itself, right? It is important for us to understand as we wrestle with these questions that Black Lives Matter is the mantra for civil rights in the 21st century. It is a demand that we moved into a society where all of us, right, whether you are a 72-year-old white male, right, in rural America facing employment discrimination as a veteran, or you are a 18-year-old trans Latina woman facing discrimination in New York City, right, because you are trans, right, that all of us have the right to live, love, and work free from fear and bigotry. Black Lives Matters is simply a mantra that says, if we lift up those who are most vulnerable in our society, right, who rate on every life scale in terms of health and education, employment, everywhere you look, on the bottom of the well, that we lift all of ourselves up in this moment. And we shouldn't forget that even as we argue the details. It is really a moment for the Jewish community not to consider itself as an ally. I talked about this on social media yesterday, right? Eschew the ally role. Your role in this moment is not to be an ally, but to find your own skin in the game, right? To be a co-conspirator, to be a partner, to be in partnership in the struggle for civil rights. Something very significant is happening in our country. Some of it is horrifying and some of it is beautiful. As we deal with the horrors, let us not forget that we need to tend the beauty. And that means entering into a courageous, curious conversation with one another that doesn't prevent us from finding ways forward, that provides excuses for us not to do anything, but provides an opportunity for us to dive in. That's really the curiosity that should be driving all of us right now. How do we ensure that each community understands and finds and leads its own skin in the game in this moment? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And we're looking forward to hearing more from you as we go along. I want to ask Carly to go ahead.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Perfect. I come to this work, you know, not as a representative of any particular movement. I come to this work not as a person of color and not honestly as a Jew, but as a wife and as a mom. I've been in a driving while black with my husband. And I learned very quickly that the rules of interacting with police were very different for him than they were for me. I remember being in a car with him in a rural road late at night, being pulled over and being asked by police if I would step out of the car because they thought my husband was attacking me, that I had been carjacked. I remember, being at home with my infant daughter and having 8 police officers show up at our door. We'd only lived in the house about 4 months, and they were looking for someone who, I guess, a former owner or former tenant, and they didn't believe him that he lived there. And it wasn't until I came downstairs holding our infant daughter and said, "Officer, can I help you?" that they calmed down, believed him, and left. So I come to these issues as someone who has seen police brutality in action, someone who has been in situations where I've had to diffuse the tension and diffuse the potential of violence against my own family members. It's a deeply personal issue for me, and I hope it's a deeply personal issue for all of you. So I want to talk about it, from that lens. I think it's important to understand that that's the lens that I'm coming from. And I want to talk a little bit more about the politics behind it. So I think, I've been in the Jewish world my whole life. My mom's a rabbi. I'm a political organizer by trade. When we talk about community organizing and issue organizing in the Jewish world, we tend to picture really hierarchical, top-down models of community engagement, of policy pushing, of lobbying, and of organizing. APAC, the Federation, a lot of GCRCs, and I certainly don't mean anything negative about that. It's just one model of doing things. The Black Lives Matter model is radically different. It is decentralized. It's not hierarchical. And that means that just because one person within that movement believes something, or even a group of people, does not mean that it has the wholesale endorsement of the movement. And that's the really important thing for you to understand. It's not as though it went before a board and everyone voted and it was privately hashed out and then became public. These are debates happening in the public sphere among some of the highest level activists and highest level leaders in the Black Lives Matter nexus. So how can I put that, that's a lot of words and a lot of jargon. How can I put that in a more concrete way? In the 1960s, it would be very, apologies for the sounds of an excited toddler, if you can hear her. In the 1960s, it would have been extremely foolish not to march with John Lewis because you disagreed with your local Black Panther Party. While these people are in a shared movement for Black lives and for racial justice, they do not always agree. And even at very high, very prominent levels, D. Ray McKesson, who you probably have heard of, takes a really different approach to policy than Alita Garza does. And if you look at Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, who's emerged as a really central figure around the protests in DC, making a point of changing Lafayette Park to be called Black Lives Matter Plaza and, painting Black Lives Matter all the way across the president's lawn. At his doorstep on the street in a pretty provocative gesture, and is now using this moment to fight for racial justice, to fight for DC statehood, to fight for the ballot and for representation for the people of DC, the majority of whom until recently were African American, and he has a long history of Black culture and a long history of Black political power. There's a clear racial justice impetus there. She has major disagreements with the local Black Lives Matter Party, the local movement, which made a point of painting "Defund the Police" right next to her street mural. She opposes defunding the police. She also led a trip to Israel with JCRC of the greater Washington area, which I'm proud to be on the board of, just, I want to say now a year and a half ago, for increased cooperation and increased trade. So just to give you a sense of how diffuse and decentralized the movement is. There are plus sides to a decentralized movement, and there are downsides to a decentralized movement. But it's really important to understand that just because you read someone, thought something on any policy, Israel or otherwise, that doesn't mean that there's wholesale buy-in around that policy throughout the movement across the board. It's just a really vital thing to understand, especially when we're talking about Zionism and about Israel. You know, something else I really wanted to touch on is the fact that I think sometimes when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we are just too quick to talk about, you know, partnership, allyship, the need to stand up for other people. And one thing I really want to impress upon you is that we're not just standing up for other people when we talk about Black Lives Matter. We're standing up for our own people. We're standing up for Black Jews. We're standing up for Black people of color, for families like mine, for kids like, you know, about these kids are going to grow up free. I would them indicator, you know, when we talk about police in schools, there's a huge Georgetown study that came out last year. My only 3-year-old Black daughter, statistically more likely to be punished more harshly, more likely to have criminal charges brought against her, more likely to be suspended or expelled than her white peers. So it's really important to, you know, remember that when we're talking about this movement and our role in it, we have a responsibility, not just because we're Jews who believe in Tikkun Olam, and not just because B'Tselem Elohim, we're all made in God's image and we all deserve to be treated with dignity and equity, but because there are Black Jewish lives on the line and we cannot walk away from them and fulfill our responsibility to each other as each other's keepers, as all of Israel is responsible for each other. I want to talk for a minute about Israel. You know, as we talk about the next generation, so many people come to me and they say, you know, how do we focus on Jewish continuity? How do we talk about Israel with the next generation? How do we talk about Jewish engagement? How do we, you know, get people to join synagogues all across the Jewish continuity spectrum? If you want to know a surefire way to lose the next generation of American Jews, it is to pit their Jewish community and their Jewish communal values and their Zionism against, excuse me, I'm on a call, is to pit their Jewish, speaking of the next generation, my next generation is right here with me. No, please go watch your Peppa Pig. I'll be done in a few moments, my love. Yeah. Hold on one moment, sorry. It's the joy of working from home in a pandemic. You want to say hello? Hi. Now I'm going to bribe her away. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Oh, you see the whole thing? Okay, go. Bye-bye. I love you. Bye-bye. That was our deal. Can you close the door? You speak of the next generation and they will appear with their demand for another chocolate.
So true.
So where was I? Oh, yes. If you want to lose the next generation, and I mean really lose them forever, force them to pick between their Jewish identity, Jewish communal leadership positions, Israel, and their neighbors, their friends. The civil rights movement that is growing up all around them, that all of us on this call know is right. You wouldn't be on this call if you didn't know there was something worth fighting for here. If you didn't know in your bones that we are a country that needs a reckoning on race and needs to fight our ingrained white supremacy. So, you know, if you want to lose that generation forever, make them pick. We don't have to do that. And I urge all of you not to. I think it's important to note that Black Lives Matter has never lobbied to cut funding for Israel. It doesn't lobby as an entity, not as one combined entity. There has never been a Black Lives Matter lobby day. You know, there are portions of the community that hold anti-Israel views, that hold views that I find to be not just critical, but really anti-Zionist. I disagree, and I will not ever allow that to push me out of the fight for a more equitable and more just America. And you shouldn't either. And I know there are people who will come to you in your communities and say, how can you stand with this anti-Semitic group? How can you stand with this anti-Israel group? It's really important to push back on that. It's one of the biggest things that you can contribute to this. And I'll add one more thing. As we talk about contributions and Jewish contributions, it's a great moment to look at our own synagogues and our own institutions and ask ourselves, how can we do better? We can't be in synagogues together right now. And that gives us a rare opportunity to ask ourselves, how can our synagogue be more welcoming? You know, the first time my husband went to synagogue, someone walked right up to him. He was wearing a full suit and a kippah and said, "Are you the cab for Mr. Schwartz? He's right over there." It was a long time before we came back, like 2 years. And we didn't go back there. And I've never gone back there. So I'm going to wrap it up. I know I'm out of time. But this is a really good moment, not just on the policy level, but on the personal level, to ask ourselves and take all of that as being part of Black Lives Matter and part of this movement. How can we, you know, dismantle racism every day? And how can we be more inclusive and more equitable every day? Apologies for the kid appearance.
That was fun. What are you talking about? Thank you so much, Carly. Stephanie.
So I really appreciate Carly and Eric and sharing their insight and also their personal experiences in these spaces with us, because I think that it helps us think about our work, and it helps us think about the perspectives of moving forward. And so today I just want to kind of talk a little bit about more broadly how we as a federation system, as JCRCs, have been moving in this space and some of the places we've been, I think, since through 2016. And I think Eric, opened up well in saying, what have we learned, right, from that time? And the last time he spoke to us as a group, although he was excellent at the JCPA conference last year, but the last time we spoke about this movement for Black Lives was after the Movement for Black Lives platform in 2016, and what's happened since. And one of the things that I want to talk about is that what we learned then, and one of the reactions at the time, and IAN put together talking points then about what is Black Lives Matter, what is a movement for Black Lives, how is it different, somewhat, and we updated them recently. Most of you, I know, received them over the last couple of weeks. But thinking about why weren't we at the table, right? As we heard from Eric, this is a loose organization of different groups, different individuals who have a stake in the process of civil rights in America. And this is our, right, someone I think said before, Black Lives Matter is our civil rights call for 2020. Certainly we have a lot of calls for 2020. But in thinking about where we, as a Jewish community, what our relationships looked like in 2016 with the Black community, so many of us were quick to reach out to local members of the NAACP or the Urban League, who we had long-standing relationships with. And what we realized was that that didn't necessarily match some of the voices of the current movement. And for many, when we were raising a flag about the Movement for Black Lives platform, and showing our really strong condemnation about some of the language that was in it. But we also needed to, and some of us did this, and we didn't maybe do it as well as we could have, is say, but you know what? We support 97% of the rest of the platform, right? We support that police reform needs to be looked at. We support, and JCPA has led the way on many criminal justice issues over the past few years and taking that movement kind of by the hand. But where did we go from here? And so one thing that I heard actually on a call earlier today that we did with our young leadership directors, JFNA, in which two of our colleagues, Carol Brick-Turin and Josh Sales, spoke, was Josh talked about what happened after the tragedy in Pittsburgh and why that's important to their relationships with their local Black community, but also their local Muslim community and other communities, and the work we do as JCRCs on a daily basis. And I think part of that is that we saw that communities were there for us, right? And we are in a pivotal moment right now where our brothers and sisters in the Black community are hurting, right? There is so much pain going on, and Carly spoke about some of this in her personal experiences. There is so much pain that people feel on a daily basis. And I think sometimes it's hard for us to put ourselves in those shoes. But what we could see is when people are there for us, how do we react to that? and how should we be standing for other communities right now? And as Carly pointed out, how do we stand for our own? One of the things that we're doing at JFNA is really looking at what do we do inside, right? How do we work on diversity and inclusion and making sure voices of our communities are heard? We know we need to do better, right? And what are the tools that our federations and JCRCs need to help achieve those goals? And one thing I just wanted to clarify is that this conversation is playing out differently in every community. And this is not the kind of situation where, and certainly it says something to our structure, and sometimes I know there are other national Jewish organizations that might be on the call that have a very top-down approach. But for the federations and JCRCs, really we believe all politics is local, and how these issues play out in a Miami, in a Portland, in a Seattle, in New York City are going to be very different. And so while we kind of look to provide resources and guidance, understanding your local nature and how this fits in, and for some communities, it's a challenge to say Black Lives Matter because and someone was writing in the chat box, because of certain political statements made by leaders in the Republican Party or by the president that create a charged divide, right? In other communities, we have to start with Black Lives Matter, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so I think thinking about that and how we engage in this work in our individual communities, noting that it's going to be a little bit different in each place. One of the things that I think we've been very attuned to, and I personally loved and shared Carly's article all over my Facebook and social media, but is where some of these sources are coming from. And someone just mentioned synagogues damaged with anti-Semitic graffiti. And there were some articles about situations that were going on in different parts of the country where there was one source and there was one eyewitness account saying that actually it was pro-Palestinian groups and there was graffiti all over synagogues. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what they were talking about, but there was graffiti all over synagogues and that really this is an anti-Semitic movement. And it was later found out, and we've been working very closely with the Secure Communities Network, and they've been working with law enforcement to find out what's really going on in a lot of these protests. And those one eyewitness account was proved wrong. But many organizations kept feeding it over the course of a number of days, creating a narrative that actually was far from the truth. And we experience this, certainly, we work on BDS issues and delegitimization of Israel issues every day. And we know that oftentimes the PR around a specific incident is actually driving the story more than the incident itself. And so I think we all need to be very cautious in how we take in news and how we take in specific details about a situation, particularly now when people are looking to drive political wedges, as Eric said before, between the Black and Jewish communities, between the Jewish community, right? We are dealing with not just this issue, but multiple issues in the Jewish community where people are trying to drive wedges. And so we need to be very mindful of that. In terms of the differences between Black Lives Matter, and this is maybe a good personal experience I had this weekend, was I live very close to Museum of Natural History, and there is a Teddy Roosevelt statue that is frankly, one of the strangest statues I've ever seen in my life and has gotten a lot of press and is going to be taken down. That could be a conversation for another day, but there was a rally that went on this weekend on Sunday, and there were kind of warring Black Lives Matter groups. And I don't know if warring is the right word, probably not. But what happened was there was a small Save the Statue group. Then there was a Black Lives Matter, but homosexuality is bad, and we love Jesus group, right? And I'm pointing this out to show that there are lots of different voices within Black Lives Matter. And then there was a kind of like, a usual maybe Black Lives Matter progressive crowd. It is the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And once one group started talking, they realized that they didn't have a lot in common. And so then there became 3 police barricaded groups. I mention that because this is in one block at one protest. We have 2 different Black Lives Matter groups saying very different things. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter not being a centralized movement, for me, nothing like spelled it out better than actually being in that space on Sunday and seeing it for myself And I think I'm just trying to create that visual for everyone because it really does show that there are a lot of different voices, just like there are a lot of different voices within our own Jewish communities. And we have to kind of think about all of them. But the idea that Black Lives Matter, right, which is not just an organization or many organizations, but is actually the idea that we need to hold that Black lives are important. And we as a long time have dealt with racism in this country and have not, as white people, have not always acknowledged that in the way that we should, and the importance of it. And so I just wanted to close with that and know that we have a lot of work to do, and acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do within our own Jewish communities in terms of bringing in and lifting up Black Jews and Jews of color, and that we have work to do with our partners, and many of these relationships are relationships that we've had over time, and really starting to build those.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, I've gotten some questions via chat, and I think I'll, why don't I go post two of them that I think I've heard a couple times in different versions, okay? The first one is from Jason Fruithandler. I'm going to read some of it here. To what extent should we expect leaders to call out anti-Semitic for sure, and to a lesser extent anti-Israel rhetoric or actions? Put another way, I am a Black Lives Matter supporter in a politically diverse synagogue, and one refrain I hear repeatedly from those who are skeptical of the movement for Black lives is, where is the condemnation of violence or an anti-Semitic act? They often point specifically to the anti-Semitic graffiti or destruction during the riots. The argument is that this is a non-central diverse leadership doesn't, if I can't point toward a vocal leaders who condemn the anti-Semitism found in these subsections of the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay. The second one, and this is from Marla, paraphrase because I would have to scroll up very high up on the chat, really has to do with police. And, you know, I know we defund the police and what does it really mean? But, you know, for many Jews, we've come to rely, especially since Squirrel Hill, on the police to guard our institutions. And yet we know for many Jews of color that can feel a little threatening. We also know that, and I think some Jews, she's saying, might be worried about putting the Black Lives Matter sign, for example, and I've seen them on synagogues myself in our area, because they're worried that they might send a certain signal to the police that are protecting them. How do we deal with this rather excruciating dilemma? So why don't I start with those two questions? We'll start with you, Eric.
Yeah, no, I think these are great questions. You know, I think a few things come to mind in this moment. So, you know, one is what it tells us in American society is we have yet done a good enough job in terms of really placing anti-Semitism as a critical issue out there, right? There are too many people, right? And I'm going to put the white nationalist movement aside, right? Whose whole ideology is grounded in anti-Semitism. So let's just set them aside. Let's just talk about everyone else. And I think we've fallen short. I still think, I just opened up, I don't know if folks saw it today, you know, but I opened up CNBC today, popped up on, you know, my social media story about, you know, record level of donations by billionaires in this country. And the photo, right, is with Donald Trump with two individuals of Jewish descent in front of a menorah, right? That's the image on top of this article. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, 61% of billionaires in this country, right, are white, right? Something like, you know, I think, you know, a higher number, you know, are non-Jewish. And it's funny, every time we talk about wealth in this country in the media, what photos get put up. It's kind of like when we talk about a crime in this country, it's ironic, you know, Black folks are 14% of the population, yet they are probably 90% of the photos when we talk about crime in this country. And that tells us that anti-Semitism and racism are still at work in our country. But let me talk about the move for Black Lives and Black Lives Matters protest in particular. So there's one truth we all have to hold right now. And you can look at photo after photo, right? I will bet this, right? This is true. We know the majority of folks taking part in the movement for Black Lives protests are actually not Black, right? 14% of the American population is Black in America, right? And that is not the majority of these marches. The majority of folks joining these marches are actually not part of Black Lives Matters, right? Or Black organizations. And so there are a lot of individuals on the streets. And, I'm not saying that it's not Black folks, because I'm not a person, look, I know Black folks also propagate the anti-Semitism in our society, and sometimes in dangerous ways, such as we witnessed in Jersey City, right, and in Brooklyn last year. And so I'm not a person who is unaware. What I'm trying to say is what is happening in demonstrations is much more complex, right? You have protesters out there, you have looters out there, you have folks who just want to riot out there, and you have provocateurs out there. I can show you story after story, right, of white nationalists, right, and sometimes even law enforcement officers who have been involved in trying to create wedges out there on the streets, right? There are folks who are trying to make points, right, that have nothing to do with the goals of the Black community and the Black Lives Matter activists on the streets. But so what do we do about that in those moments where it is really kind of this loose network and it's a populist kind of response? And if I'm in the Jewish community, I'm not from the Jewish community, right? But I'm aware enough of anti-Semitism present day and historic to say something very honest to the Jewish community. I get very fully why populist moments, right, are frightening to the Jewish community. Because if I could speak to everyone in this country, I would say populist moments have never worked out well for the Jewish community mostly, right? They have become incubation spaces for anti-Semitism historically. And it's time for this populist moment to get it differently. And the way we get it differently is by encouraging and creating the space, right, for Black leaders, right, to express their condemnation of anti-Semitism. But there's a catch to that, right? If we encourage and create that space that allows them to do it, we then have to acknowledge when they actually do it, right? Carly is an archivist on social media who keeps record after record. We can go after, she might even be able to do this off the top of her head, right? The number of African-American leaders, right, who have come out publicly, including within the Black Lives Matters movement, right, condemning anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Now, we know the complications, right? There's one thing about speaking out against racism, right, in a kind of larger macro way, and it means something else to kind of engage in a tangible way. So too is it with anti-Semitism. And we have to keep nudging people along to understand that anti-Semitism is not just about saving the life. Fighting anti-Semitism is not just about saving the life of the Jewish community. It is how we save our own lives in America in this moment. And even we as the Black community and Black leaders, we have to do better. But we can't do better, right, if there is no dialogue, right? If you think the Black Lives Matters movement is the equivalent, right, of the white nationalist movement, I doubt we are deeply engaged with that movement, right? And so what I tell folks is, yes, point it out, right? There was targeting and graffiti of Jewish businesses and synagogues in LA, right? I read the stories of what happened in New Jersey. We need to lift those up, but we need to lift them up as an opportunity for Black leaders to step up and to condemn that. And that means having the hard relationships to make that necessary.
But Eric, I have a question from one of our people to follow up on this.
Yeah.
Josephine Gahn in Palm Beach. You know, she's asking, how do we show our support, given that there are so many voices, no main leadership? It's not like we can march arm in arm with MLK. And even if we do show our support, how will they know us? Like, you know, it's been challenging to figure out what the address if there's no address.
There's no address. There are some addresses. So we should say, like, you know, there are entities, though. There are organizations within the larger movement for Black lives, right? There are you know, I don't want to call them personalities. There are organizers, right, who are part of specific entities, such as Black Lives Matters, right? It is an actual entity, right? So is Color of Change. So is the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So is the Minnesota Fund for Bail Fund for Justice. So there are real entities, but here's my take. If we really want to build that connection, and then I'll shut up and let others speak. The way to build that connection is by investing in Jewish youth, right? Who already are trying to make those connections, right? It's about supporting them in making those connections, making those relationships, right? And making sure it's vibrantly so. And that they don't just go into it being allies. I mean, you know, again, I don't want to bash, you know, being allies, but that there is actually skin in the game for the Jewish community, right? To speak out and to have a say, right? And this doesn't speak to the police security piece. So I hope to come back to, I want to say, I don't want to just toss that off as not a big deal. I think it is a really big deal when you look at attacks on Jewish businesses and houses of worships and cultural spaces, right? And so that is something that those of us who say defund the police actually have to come up with a solution to, right? We have to be able to speak to that in very real ways. We can't just say, oh, that's unimportant, right? But we can't do that unless we're in dialogue with you, because we're not going to be able to find the right answer without being in dialogue. And I think it's through the generation that is coming up right now. I think that's the sweet spot.
Great.
But now I'm going to be quiet.
We're running out of time because you've been so great. Carly, do you want to add something on this?
I'd like to jump in and make a couple points. Can people hear me? No.
We hear you.
Perfect. Then go play with your pretend umbrella. A couple things. I think that's one of the things that's really great when we have inter-community dialogue is to be generous when you think about the other community and their viewpoint and their motivations, and maybe a little more cynical and harder on your own community. Eric is being fairly generous in how he looks at the analysis here, and I will, as someone who loves the Jewish community and is a young Jewish community leader, be slightly less generous. If you don't read Black writers, and you don't follow them on Twitter, and you don't read Black press, you won't hear the condemnation. You won't hear them talking about anti-Semitism because you're not listening and you're not reading them. I'll give you a good example. So many people have said to me, no one from Black Lives Matter ever condemned anti-Semitism attacks this winter. It's simply not true. I could start listing people, but I'll pick one example. Anthony Beckford, president of Black Lives Matter Brooklyn. Not only did he put out multiple statements the day of the Jersey City attack and the day of the Muncie City attack, he later physically got in between an Orthodox man in Brooklyn and a Black man harassing him on the bus and said, that's not going to happen on my watch. not in my neighborhood, not on my bus line, back away. No one talks about that. And it's not because people aren't out there making the statements, it's because we're not reading them. And some of that has to fall a little on us. So yes, I could list Ilhan Omar, Mark Lamont Hill, two people I've criticized very publicly. And, you know, across the spectrum of racial justice politics, you know, enormous condemnations of rising anti-Semitism. But if you're not reading their work, you're not going to hear it. So that's just one. When it comes to the police in synagogue issue, I think we need to be circumspect and look at different approaches in different communities as are appropriate. You know, I was very skeptical about the idea of having more police at my synagogue. I was very worried about it. Statistically, if you look at all the major studies, it makes my family and my kid, which is the whole reason I joined a synagogue, less safe. That said, there are steps you can take. You can insist on meeting with your local police officers, meeting with their, you know, meeting with public servants and letting them know who you are and the behavior that you hope they will bring to your community. You can use this as a community building moment, not a community breaking moment. It's not an all or nothing approach. And in addition, you know, again, I think we have to think about it through this lens of, it's very hard to take me seriously with a pink umbrella in the background. I know, I'm sorry. You know, I think we have to think about it from this lens of how do we always come to security in a way that makes everyone safe in our whole broader community and have those hard conversations.
Great, thank you. Well, it is 3:30 and we probably could go on forever, but we're going to respect everybody's time commitments and know that we can go back to Eric and Carly, and also that you on an individual level can invite them to talk as well, and that you can do that through emailing us, and we're happy to you know, do the shidduch here, okay? So very thankful and appreciative of this conversation, of the opportunity to actually bring some issues up and to hear from you both and from Stephanie about how we should think about this and how to navigate it. And we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so much, and we'll look forward to continuing discussion on Black Lives Matter in the Jewish community in the days to come. Be well.